and then we'll get started. Okay, I know people are still coming in, but I'll go ahead and welcome everybody. My name is Chelsea Lake. I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore. I'd like to welcome you to PMP Live. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. At any point during the event, you can click on the link that I'll be dropping in the chat to purchase Left Behind, the Democrats' failed attempt to solve inequality. You can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A. This feature can be found along the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions, but I apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. We are delighted to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To access captions, simply click on the live transcripts option, which is also along the bottom of your screen. And now onto our event. In Left Behind, political historian Lily Geismer shows how the Democratic Party of the 80s and 90s, particularly during the height of the Clinton years, peddled policy ideas that centered on helping the poor without asking the rich to make any sacrifices, doing well by doing good, micro-lending becoming a big business, and private programs to promote democracy and equality abroad grew trendy. But as social programs in the private sector boomed, the structure of the government began to weaken, contributing to a crisis that has now fully arrived. Lily Geismer is an associate professor of history at Claremont McKenna College, where she teaches courses on recent urban and political history. She has earned fellowships from the Carnegie Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Charles Warren Center at Harvard University. She's also a member of the American Historical Association and the Organization of American Historians. Her previous book is Don't Blame Us: Suburban Liberals and the Transformation of the Democratic Party. Geismer will be in conversation with Perry Bacon Jr., a Washington Post columnist. Before joining the Post in 2021, Perry had stints as a government and elections writer for Time magazine, the Post National Desk, Grio, and 538. He has also been an on-air analyst at MSNBC and a fellow at New America. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the screen over to you, and we'll see you at the end.
Okay. Chelsea, thank you for the introduction. Lily, thanks for being here. And I'll start with kind of the broad conclusion, broad founding of the book. So I came into this book and the thing about the Clinton era, probably like other people, which is kind of this idea that, thinking that the Clinton era was full of triangulation and Sister Souljah, and the kind of general idea that the Clinton era Democrats moved to the quote unquote center largely for electoral reasons. It was like they were just trying to win, and this is the way they did it. And your book concludes something different, which is that there was a real ideology and real values and that the quote unquote new Democrats really held. So can you start by talking about what that ideology was broadly, and maybe talk about that in terms of education policy and housing policy? I think people know about welfare reform. Maybe education and housing are two issues, but talk about the broad part first and then narrow down on those issues after that.
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. I also want to say thank you to Chelsea and Politics and Prose for having me, and also to you, Perry, for doing this. I'm a huge fan of yours, so this is like the biggest joy to me. And I'm also appreciative to your family for giving you over at this difficult time of 6 p.m. But this question around sort of rethinking the Clinton era was critical to what I was trying to do with the project, which is to kind of challenge that idea that there's often this notion that sort of, especially kind of the Democratic Party more broadly, that everything that they've done since the 1960s has been in reaction to the Republicans, and this kind of idea of sort of outflanking the Republicans in various different ways, which is really what is at the heart of the kind of triangulation thesis. That was Dick Morris's electoral strategy in 1996. And what I wanted to show is it wasn't just kind of this defensive or reactionary ideas, especially in the Clinton era, and who the New Democrats, the DLCs, embrace of market-based solutions, wasn't just reactionary, but also was part of a particular ideology of using the market and the private sector to essentially do good and to address the kinds of issues of social inequality and poverty that have long been kind of the core ideas of Democrats, but to do that in a different way. So instead of using explicitly government as the solution, you could do it through market-oriented ideas. And it isn't just about profit. And I think that's actually really critical to the places that in the two examples you gave. And so the book itself looks at this in a variety of different arenas, and two of them are education and housing. And I think that with education in particular, it wasn't just like profit oriented. So I think there's often this way that that's the story of the more kind of Republican or conservative side of market oriented solutions or ideas. But it was really using the techniques and ideas of the market to make the public sector make sort of things that were traditional, that were public goods, like education, work better. And so you can really see that with charter schools. And so charter schools are traditionally seen as a kind of Republican solution, but they really come into fruition in the Clinton era and really promoted in conversation with the tech industry. So the book looks at this idea of kind of using the techniques of the market, and charters are this kind of more efficient model. They're innovative, they're disruptive, so that makes them really appealing to the tech industry. You are asking for accountability, and that will ultimately make a social good like education work better. With housing, the core program of the Clinton era to address public housing, which I have a chapter of the book looks at, is the Hope 6 program, which was the idea of replacing traditional big public housing projects like the Robert Taylor homes and Cabrini Green, or the iconic ones in Chicago, with more mixed income developments. And those were similarly the idea that you kind of use the market in various different ways, but had more of a chance for in partnership with the private sector, and had more chances for private gain. So you replace what was once these big public housing projects with both mixed income sort of townhouse style housing, or with vouchers like Section 8 housing.
So in some ways, that phrase they use, third way, is kind of true, is that basically the ideology was that the government is kind of ineffective, as the Republicans say, but also that it can't be done by the private sector fully, or it can't be done by profit. Like, to explain the ideology in terms of how it's third from the two traditional ones.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way of thinking it third way. I often think about it as a kind of a democratic version of neoliberalism, although that's can be a little bit jargony. But the way to think about it is that, like, the traditional, the pure conservative approach would be like just like leave it to the private sector, and you kind of let the private sector like unleash its creative capacity. And this democratic version that sort of that comes into sort of being under through the Democratic Leadership Council and Bill Clinton and sort of the New Democrats, that eventually gets framed as the third way, is the idea of kind of government as catalyst. So the role of the government is to help the private sector do good through a variety of different techniques, like tax credits, other types of programs that will kind of incentivize the public sector to do work that was once largely within the purview of the government. And one of the things I try to argue in the book is that what this does is actually it can have some short-term gains, but it actually leads to limiting the social welfare state and limiting the state from doing other kinds of work, or it replaces what the state could do with the private sector.
So your analysis is generally that we sort of overstate why the electoral, we sort of think too much this evolved because of electoral considerations, but address that a little bit. Was there an electoral, talk about the electoral part of the third way. How much of that was motivating it, and where does that, if our general narrative is slightly overstating it, was that still apparent?
Yeah, so one of the other things I try that is really central to the kind of argument that I was going against is that when people look at the sort of classic story of the Democratic Leadership Council and its role in the Democratic Party through Bill Clinton was that everything was about just getting elected, and it was all about kind of electoral strategy, and that was really their legacy on the Democratic Party. And one of the things that I try to show is that it wasn't just about an electoral strategy; it was also about changing the sort of ideology of the Democratic Party, much more towards a vision of kind of faith in economic growth and opportunity as the solutions to both the party's success but also the country's success. And so some of that is sort of shifting away from a perceived idea that the Democrats stood for redistributive solutions as opposed to these kind of private sector solutions, and that the way to kind of help people is to give them more chances and opportunity to kind of take individual initiative or responsibility. And I look at the ways that actually has there's electoral components to that and trying to appeal to particular kinds of voters. And so in another key part of the DLC's strategy and ideology was that the Democratic Party had become too beholden to special interest groups, especially to labor. And so turning away from that, and so I think in some ways it's both the Democratic Party's electoral strategy, or the electoral strategy, but also its kind of political focus on the economy had become too focused on labor. And so together, by shifting over to kind of more new economy sectors like tech, like trade, like finance, that would help the Democratic Party, that would help the country regain economic growth, help the Democratic Party's fortune, but also appeal to a particular kind of voter, which is much more moderate suburban voters, especially in places in the South and Midwest who are seemingly trending towards the Republican Party, and to sort of recapture them. So there is a component that actually is about electoral strategy, but I try to show how it's also really deeply tied to ideology and policy.
I led to thinking the voter it's not necessarily the Bubba voter. It might include the Bubba, but it's also the Lily who works in an office park in Arlington, right? As part of it is like and maybe it's more about the office park worker than the Bubba worker, because
Absolutely. I think it's the idea that you can sort of capture some of the sort of, and the way, I mean, some of this, so that is very much the core voter and this predates Clinton to some degree. I mean, this goes back, and the book looks at this about the kind of who are known as the Watergate babies or the Atari Democrats, like who understand that believe that the fortunes of the Democratic Party lie with the people who work in the Arlington, Virginia office park. But I think what makes Bill Clinton such an appealing candidate and is recognized is that he can also appeal to white working class Southern voters, that he has this particular kind of populism, and also given his sort of Southern roots, that he is a unique candidate that can address a lot of different types of people. So he sort of, I mean, this is the classic kind of contradictions of Clinton. Like he has this kind of policy wonky side to him, but also can recast that in a kind of much more populist language that is quite appealing to a wider swath of the electorate.
So the book talks about Arkansas a lot in a way that I don't think I understood. So talk about some of the lessons in terms of Clinton believed these policies in part because of some of the things that happened in Arkansas in his governorship. Talk about that, how he sort of tried to he thought those did work and tried to bring those to Washington. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so one of the things that I look at is Clinton's career in Arkansas, which is really interesting in a variety of ways, and I think often doesn't get a huge amount of attention to his larger career. But he was really committed to issues of economic development in Arkansas, that he saw that as sort of critical to the state's economic fortunes. It was a state he became governor first in 1978, loses, but then again in 1982. And it was a state that was really feeling the effects of globalization. And even all these manufacturing plants had left Arkansas. It had severe poverty, particularly among the Black community, and in the rural parts of the state and the rural southern parts of the state. And so one of the things that he tries to do is experiment with different kinds of economic development and thinks about this kind of new tech model of kind of bringing in new kinds of businesses and industry, especially banking. So he recruits from Chicago, a group of bankers who've been experimenting with community development banking to try to bring more of a banking model into low-income communities in Arkansas. And then also, as part of that project, recruits Muhammad Yunus, who's the founder of Grameen Bank, to start a microfinance program in rural Arkansas. So these are seen as kind of solutions and new ways to address poverty and inequality, and that can both help people but also bring new kinds of economic development to a state like Arkansas. And Clinton comes to really believe that is a kind of core model for how you could address a new way of addressing these sort of persistent problems of poverty and inequality. And they become really important to his 1992 campaign, that this was kind of this new solutions that he's going to bring both to rural areas, but also to urban areas like South LA, like the South Bronx and like the South Side of Chicago.
So the book is titled Left Behind, and the subtitle is The Democrats' Failed Attempts to Solve Inequalities. So if I get Bruce Reed, Al From, Hillary, and Bill here, I think they would probably say, was everything perfect? No, but we won 2 elections. The deficit came way down. We had this huge economic expansion during that time. So are you sure this was a failed attempt? Talk about why you view it as failed.
Well, I think, and that's true. I mean, there's this way that growth, that there was larger growth, but there is, first of all, after the Clinton era, inequality only widens. And so there's a way that's after the era. But I think a few things happen. One is not to say that a lot of the programs that were that the Clinton administration implemented, like microfinance or community development banking, aren't necessarily bad ideas in their own right. They're good. There's a lot of really important ways that those are good programs. But the problem is those by themselves, they're what I call micro solutions to macro problems. They can't on their own solve the problems of inequality and poverty. And that's often how they were getting purported to do. So there's an over-promising of what these kinds of programs can do. That to me is part of the reason why it's a failed attempt. I think the other thing is at the same time this is going on. And so part of the logic is that you can use the kind of techniques of the new economy to address problems of inequality, like the tech industry and banking and trade. And those aspects of the economy actually changed dramatically over the course of the 1990s with deregulation. And so you're using a system that in itself is changing to try to solve the problem. And I think what ends up happening by the end of the decade is that there might be overall growth, but it leaves particularly poor and low-income people in a much, much more vulnerable position, and also open to a lot more predation as to what happened. And that sort of becomes borne out a decade later.
The borne out thing is interesting because one of the things you seem to capture in the book is that Clinton and people like that are ascending in government. And so a lot of the things that he sort of seeded the ground in Arkansas are sort of failing by like 1995, but he's already in the government. And my sense is a lot of the things that he does in government start failing, but he's also now, that's clear by 2004. So why was it so hard was it clear during the governing period that these ideas were failing and they ignored it, or was it more that you couldn't tell in the midst of it?
I think there's probably a combination. I mean, there's a way, and I think that happens when you have and the other thing I think that happens with a lot of programs is they work in one place, but are not necessarily fit to work everywhere. So the idea of, the Shore Bank, which is a fantastic community bank in Chicago, it works really well. It works well in Chicago, but it doesn't necessarily translate to being in other places. And this idea that you can move things around, I mean, you can move ideas around, or that microfinance, which is working in Bangladesh, although that is often questionable, can work in rural Arkansas. that, I think that's part of so that it doesn't necessarily work. But I think there's still a faith in it, and a faith in what's a somewhat a technocratic solution. I also think, I mean, and this goes to the other part of the Left Behind title, which is the lack of pushback in the 1990s from the political left. And so what ends up happening through I mean, I think going back to the success of the Clinton era electorally, and pressure from the Republicans really crowds out a meaningful opposition from the left. And so there's not at the moment a lot of unified opposition to what's going on. So there is on particular issues like welfare reform, or I also look at around sweatshop labor, and globalization, where you have these campaigns come up, but it's not a sustained unified coalition. So that also contributes to not to sort of letting things keep going without without levels of accountability.
Because you conclude the book, or one of the final chapters is Clinton and Jesse Jackson go on a tour together. Can you talk about that? Because that, looking at it now, it's like the person who was probably right is sort of conceding the person who was sort of wrong in a certain way. So talk about that.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the Jesse Jackson emerges in the book, and I think generally in sort of recent American history is like one of the most fascinating figures. And I mean, he throughout much of the 80s and early 90s, Jesse Jackson is really the sort of the foil to the Democratic Leadership Council. And there's these sort of really intense exchanges dating back to the 1984 election when Jesse Jackson runs, that he's kind of the alternative to where the Democratic Party is going. And there's like a series of really tense exchanges, not just the sister soldier moment, but even like before that, where Jesse Jackson he gets into a physical altercation with members of the DLC almost physical altercation at one of the conventions. He's not invited to another DLC convention. And so, and him and Clinton themselves have this really fraught relationship that is sort of crystallized in that, in the sister soldier moment. And then over the course of the 1990s, and so Clinton continues to they continue to have various different sort of tensions. That relationship changes, and Jesse Jackson goes with Clinton on this tour, this new markets tour, and this effort to kind of highlight the ways of sort of the market potential in poor and low income communities across the United States. And it has to do with Jackson's starts a program called the Wall Street Project, which is about connecting Wall Street corporations on Wall Street with poor and low income communities. And so there's this kind of convergence of their projects. But that sort of is the moment to end with it. Like the person who was probably the biggest vocal opponent ends up sort of joining in the larger cause. Largely there's probably a more complicated reason for why Jesse Jackson makes that decision, but that to me is the kind of culmination of the kind of power of these ideas.
So this is outside of the book scope a little bit, but how do these ideas play out in the Obama administration?
Yeah, and so in many ways, I see Obama as like the Obama years as like a continuation, and I gestured to this in the epilogue. But I think Obama takes on a lot of these types of this kind of market-oriented approach. I mean, I think there's a real faith, and actually, the book's genesis was actually in the Obama years, because it takes a long time to write a history book. So I started in 2014. I mean, and probably even earlier. I mean, one of the things I was really fascinated by, and one of the basic things that launched this book was my students' faith in the market to do good. And that I had all these students who were going to work in the private sector because they wanted to do good. And they were all Democrats. And so I wanted to understand why this was happening. But I think the faith that the Obama era promotion of entrepreneurship is a clear continuation of the tech industry, of Silicon Valley, of a lot of the kind of charter school oriented approaches to education, sees as sort of fulfillment and a continuation of a lot of these types of ideas. And I think that what ends up happening is that that's another moment of kind of somewhat myopia to the fact that a lot of people were still feeling very much left behind by that approach. And I think that it's there in Occupy, but then especially by 2015, that there's just this real sense that this is not working and this version of the Democratic Party and what it's offering is not working for large swaths of the American public.
So I thought about your book again on Tuesday because the first year of the Biden administration seemed very much like the end of the new Democratic era had ended. The new Democrats had been retired. The DLC had ended, and in a sort of a big government kind of Democratic Party had returned. So that's 2021. 2022 is fund the police. But I get the sense that you might distinguish those things between you can have. So talk about that. Like, you talk about that because I think your frame is interesting, but talk about, have we entered a new era of sort of the new Democrats or new Democratic thing is done, or are we going to come back to that if the Democrats lose the midterms?
Well, it's interesting because I think in some ways that that Clintons have lost their kind of, especially Bill Clinton, his kind of position in aura within the Democratic Party. That was represented at the 2020 convention in various different ways. But I think a lot of the ideas have persisted, and I think the many of the approaches are very much still within the realm of possibility. In one way, Biden himself was a member of the DLC, and there are many people from the Clinton era in the Biden administration. So that's one thing to bear in mind. But I think especially that the idea that you sort of after midterms play to that you go back to trying to win over particular moderate voters through a less progressive mechanisms. And there's a way of kind of couching. There's questions about what Biden's trying to do, if he's trying to couch progressive policies through more moderate terms. But I was really struck watching and then reading the State of the Union, how little there's discussion of questions of poverty and also race. So defund the police is an obvious one, but even that most of the solutions are about middle class voters, which to me seems like a very clear return to the approach that I think Clinton's and also Obama used as a mechanism to gain electoral support. So I think that there did seem like there was this brief window where inequality, thinking about poverty and inequality, was back somewhat on the agenda, and I've seen that. I've been feeling that as the midterms are approaching, that language is starting to really drop out. So there wasn't a lot of discussion about housing. There's certain things that become, and instead these types of things. But I think that the defund the police one is a really fascinating way of, is this a return to a particular kind of racialized politics that I know you've written about too. That's one way that I sort of think about it. I'm fascinated. There's not the same faith in the market. Like if you look at, looking at some of Obama's speeches and how much he sort of used this language of kind of growth and opportunity that is really sort of critical to the kind of New Democrat ethos. I don't see as much of that. So some of the kind of going back to like the private sector can do good language is not there quite as much, a little bit, but less so. So I'll be curious if that's my other thing. That if some of these solutions come back too, what the implications are.
So so in that answer you said, okay. But your story of the Clinton era was there was an ideological belief in this stuff and an electoral strategy. Are we now at the point where it's just electoral politics are dictating that they move to the center, and that's what they're just? It seems to me like listen to Biden that he's sort of beyond neoliberalism as a ideology, but he is for it, whatever sounds centrist to get to 50%. Is that
well,
right?
I think the difference, so the difference, Clinton to Biden is that Clinton and the DLC wanted to change the direction of the Democratic Party. Like they had an ideological mission that they were going to shift the party. And this is often called centrism or I think or however you want to think about the kind of particular ideology of what they were approaching. I don't see that Biden is less ideological. So I think he's more like a Democrat's Democrat. That's always how I've understood him. So it's like where the temperature of the party is and what will maintain electoral stability in some capacity or gains electoral support. I think, but what I've always argued is that has there can be short-term gains from that and really long-term consequences. And I think that's one thing that is a lesson from the Clinton era and in sort of all categories. So it might be that sort of maybe helps in the midterms, but I see that the policy dimensions of that can be really, really disastrous in some capacity.
in the in the 80s and 90s, the DLC crowd was very focused on, we don't want the party to be too focused on special interest, and that meant a lot of different things. But I think your story was convincing in the real group to push down was not Blacks but labor. Talk about why it was so important for them to sort of talk about the history, because labor had been the Democratic Party, then was kind of Democratic Party, and now I think is in vogue again. So talk about
yeah,
labor
and that is a question of like the
context.
change. And so when you think about the sort of post neoliberalism, that labor is, if you're for traditional neoliberal values, labor is antithetical, and so the embrace of labor. So part of the idea was that, I mean, traditionally that labor was the Democratic Party's biggest really special interest group, and there was a sense that it was kind of holding the party back in a variety of different ways. One, economically, was that it was making the Democrats too beholden to like a sort of manufacturing and industrial past, and needed to move towards a post-industrial future. And so if you have the AFL-CIO lobbying you heavily, you're not going to support trade and tech. But that was one of the reasons that there was concern about labor's interest. And it was also just sort of speaking about these ideas of sort of collective versus individual that labor represents, that the New Democrats and DLC are opposed to, and want to kind of support other kinds of voters or other kinds of interest, don't believe in just interest group politics generally. And I do think that it has a really devastating effect on the power of the labor movement. And that's one of the things that I was sort of struck by over the course of looking at this book, sort of where labor goes. And so you see some moments of kind of labor trying to assert itself in the 90s around things like globalization, sweatshop labor, but lose a lot of power. They remains to hold some power in the Democratic Party, and that they're often the teachers unions are the largest delegates to at conventions, but they don't hold the same kind of weight. And I do think we're in a moment where labor is coming back, and so that.
And why is that, do you think?
I mean, I think because of inequality. I think that there's a sense of like I think that like understanding that if you are trying to address experiencing sort of like degradation in various different ways in your job, that labor is a way of kind of addressing that, and that the labor movement gains material benefits and privileges through its membership. So I think that's where it's had this new kind of resurgence. And so I think it's something, I think that it has to be contended with. Like, I looked in 2016, labor was barely mentioned. I mean, I think it was only that Tim Kaine was like mentioned that his father was in a union. Like, none of the marquee speakers mentioned it, and now it's becoming it's something that candidates have to address.
If you all have questions, people want to have questions, you should put them in the Q&A. I'm going to start coming to questions in a bit. So I was struck in the book as I read it, thinking, because you do a great job, but you sort of down some of the stories about what's not working about these various programs in rural Arkansas and in Chicago. And so I was immediately struck by, and I hate to say this in a very harsh way, but is part of the problem that it has struck me, and I'll just make a comment about this, is that Bill Clinton talked about rural Arkansas on his rise in politics, gets elected president, and now basically lives in New York. Barack Obama talks about urban issues in Chicago on his rise in politics, gets elected president, and now lives in Washington, D.C. And I probably can tell, maybe living in California at some point. So is it partly that, so what's your thought about that? Is like, were they not, I don't want to say they weren't invested in the problem, but the solution was not that important to them because they could move on without it actually happening. Talk about what I'm saying. Yeah.
Well, I think in both cases they have an idea. And so actually, like, in some ways where the book ends, or where I see as the kind of culmination of this thinking, so if it's not in government necessarily, is in foundations, and that they both have these large foundations that it'll be interesting to see what Obama does with his is less sort of known, what will happen, but that you use kind of powerful connections. And so that's part of the whole Clinton Foundation idea, is based on this notion of doing well by doing good, that you kind of you bring in big corporations and big institutions, and that can help people in rural Arkansas. So I think that that's the way of sort of understanding what they're doing. That my understanding of the Obama, I mean, and it's fascinating because the Obama Foundation headquarters will be in the south side of Chicago, in the neighborhood that I look at extensively in the book. And there's a way of seeing that in and of itself as a redevelopment strategy, that this is going to help the south side of Chicago by putting the Obama Library Museum there, and you can use that as a kind of mechanism to uplift the south side. So I think those are the ways in which it's sort of helping. It's helping people, but it's from a much more kind of Olympian view than kind of being down and addressing things. And I think they both. I mean, I think that the intentions are real. Like I don't think this was all. I mean, I think there are ways that especially, and I talk about it in the book, the Clintons sort of promoted low-income people of color in various different ways as kind of within sort of idealistic tropes. But I do think genuinely we're looking to help people and saw these as ways to help people, and I think still do. But I think it's some of the ways that they've been really limited in what they can accomplish, what it has accomplished.
Let me pause for a second and ask you, since I've tried to cover what I could, before we go to questions, is there anything you really want to say about the book, or any part that you want to make sure that you address that I haven't asked about yet?
No, I'm going to ask you, but I want to ask you a question. So one thing, Perry wrote a column in the last fall about white appeasement politics, or a long essay that was really fascinating. And I'm curious sort of your thoughts about how that idea fits into this book, and then also within the how it fits into the Biden's most recent State of the Union.
So the piece kind of argued that post-Civil Rights Act, post-60s, the Democratic Party engages in what I call, white appeasement. Basically, this was a Hakeem Jefferson, a political scientist, came with this phrase, and there was Stanford. So the idea basically that, I think you can get the point, is that in a majority white country, you have to do some amount of appeasement of white interest, and it often means kind of pushing down, distancing yourself from people of color. Sister Soldier being the sort of prominent example, the welfare bill being trying to signal that we don't care too much about the poor, and maybe the perception of we're not too close to the welfare queen, so to speak. So the piece kind of argued there's a lot, when Obama said, "I'm not the president of Black America," like nobody thought, sort of a distant, I'm not that, that kind of thing. In 2016, I guess 2020, the best example, I guess, was when Biden was saying, I'm opposed to rioting, nobody thought you were for it. So I think that is kind of what I'm getting at. But my piece of, since I know some people that work at the White House, and some of them, as you said, worked in the Clinton White House too, they did not love the framing white appeasement, obviously. But more importantly, I think your book, I framed the Clinton era almost entirely through white appeasement. And your book made me sort of blanch, because I was like, I think I got that sort of wrong, is that there was a real, the policies may have been flawed and at times may have been really bad for Black people particularly, or minorities particularly, but the intentions were actually maybe better than I gave them credit for. Now, the Biden people, I don't think they actually think massive increases in police funding is a good idea. And so I actually think in this case, we are watching more, I think we are sort of, or the drop in the references to race compared to last year was dramatic. And so in that sense, I do think we are sort of just purely watching a kind of, the center means white, electable means white, and I think we are sort of, I don't get the sense, as you said, I don't get the sense Biden is that ideological. And therefore I don't think he has that depth of, I think your book actually mentions in some ways the DLC was looking for a sort of a hero in the 1980s. And on some level, Clinton, they thought would be more consistently DLC-ish, and they thought Biden was kind of wishy-washy about policies, which is kind of what he is, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is really fascinating to sort of think about that, because in some ways like so I'll say two things to just follow up, that I do think the intent, like it's important to think about intent, and in some ways that intent actually masks over consequences in ways that I think that often like it's harder to see sometimes. And so that's one thing I tried to do in the book. But I do think this new era of kind of going back, or what seems to be indicated by the State of the Union, and the kind of turn to like, let's increase police, seems like a very sort of older model of appeasement politics, like an older playbook that loses some of that nuance. So that's one thing. I agree with your assessment. I was just curious about it.
So we have a quick couple questions here. Let's go to this now. So I'm going to summarize this one. How much of the failure of new Democrat policies was due to post-1994 resistance of the congressional GOP? For instance, Clinton initially envisioned a more progressive welfare reform, but had to pass something more acceptable to Newt Gingrich.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and one I think about a lot. I think one of the things that often gets told is that like everything happened because of 1994, and it was a real thing. I think it's real constraints. Like it's not to say that the Clintons, there's a way of thinking about the prosperity of the 1990s, but the other side of it is that the Clinton administration was working within real constraints of the Republicans, who were growing in power and put real pressure on the party. I think on a couple of levels, like one thing with welfare reform, it is true that the kind of the truly draconian welfare policy welfare reforms that get passed, it was 2 vetoes that led to to the bill that does get passed, and with a lot of concessions. But I think it's important that Clinton ran on ending welfare as we know it and really believed in work-oriented welfare reform. So it's not to say that had Newt Gingrich and Contract America not happened, that there would have been what welfare reform would have looked like would have been something like from a Bernie Sanders campaign. I mean, so that is really important to recognize. I also think, one thing I've thought about a lot with the 90s and looking at them, of where it seems recent, but it's actually, in political terms, like very far away, is there actually was a lot more bipartisan agreement on particular things and so now it's like, I think that so on something like micro enterprise or a lot of the programs that I understand, there actually was a lot of bipartisan support, and sort of some negotiation and agreement. And I think that was one of the things that made it somewhat appealing in various different ways, that those ideas worked. I don't know if that would happen now. Because there just seems to be such a more entrenched party line. So I think that on certain things, there was more willingness, especially on some of these types of programs.
What were the New Democrats right about? Is anything you think about that they're right about?
Now I have to think about it. I think some of the things, as I said, I don't think all of the programs, I think a lot of them are actually good ideas. I spent the hour before I was talking to you all in office hours, because I'm a professor, with one of my students about went to a charter school, and talking about his experiences and sort of hearing about how he hears all the charter schools are negative. And so there's a spectrum of the charter experience that often gets told. And a lot of the large charter management organizations that come in the 2000s, that was not what was going on in the 90s. So I don't think all of those types of programs were bad ideas. I think the real sort of I think that in many ways the Democratic Party's, or particularly Clinton's, promotion of shore bank and community development financial institutions was often not always what the organizations were doing. But I actually think that, I came away so impressed and amazed by what shore bank did and what they were accomplishing. And I think that the CDFI program is an amazing program that needs to be funded much more fully to do what it can. But that was another thing that I think there were good ideas.
I think what's consistent appears is the party is very convinced that talking about poverty and people without money and being race forward is bad politics. Are we confident that's true, or will we never know because they'll never test it?
Yeah, that is the other piece that we didn't fully talk about, but is really central. There's this debate within the Democrats and the Democratic Party in the 1980s, the DLC is really part of, about which way to go. And so there's this famous memo called The Politics of Evasion by William Galston and Elaine Kamerick that goes into this idea that it's not about trying to win over disenfranchised, marginalized people. It's about sort of it's going after the middle, like going after like people who already vote, and that's the kind of the strategy for winning elections. And I think that seems to be this constant and perennial debate that continues to play out. And so it's true that it hasn't really been proven. I mean, I always look to the Jesse Jackson campaigns in the 1980s. Those did really well, that he was able to inspire and sort of motivate a lot of people. And so that there is potential there. I mean, I think that I think both the Warren and Sanders campaigns they didn't go full force into some of that, but there have been potential there but the larger party has been sort of more reluctant to take that course. So I think you're right. I think the other way I will say that I think the New Democrat approach, and I don't know if it's just them, but it's a bigger problem with the Democratic Party, has hurt the party, was to focus on presidential elections. So I think that's the other solution that comes up in the 1980s from this moment, is like the way to gain power is just to focus on the presidency. And I think that's actually had really long-term consequences for the Democratic Party of not deepening its foundations and infrastructure at the state and local level in the ways that I do think the Republican Party has done. And I think and that you don't have this really deep base of people coming up, but I think that's another place that there's has been a limitation.
Talk a little bit about the actual, is it Bruce Reed, Al? You read about Bruce Reed, Al Frum, Gary Hart, like sort of where did the New Democrats come from? Like is a worth asking. You tell us about history. Where did these ideas, Michael Dukakis actually for that matter, it was interesting the fact that you sort of like the story as a political reporter I always do was there was Dukakis and he was so left, and then they had to have Clinton, but in reality you sort of argue Dukakis and Clinton are the same person, just in different geographic areas with one person has an accent and one maybe did a better job defining his lack of military career. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so I wrote but the first book I wrote was Don't Blame Us, and that looks at Massachusetts, and it ends with Dukakis and this idea of kind of and sort of Clinton taking on a lot of his ideas. And I think that a lot of what Dukakis was doing he's framed as this kind of Massachusetts liberal, and that's like the failure of the party, and they're never going to go in that direction. But if you actually look at first of all, Clinton gave the nomination speech for Dukakis. It's like his worst political speech ever, but there's a lot of alignment. They both were these kind of up and coming governors, and Dukakis wasn't part of the DLC, but he's part of the kind of bigger Watergate baby Atari Democrat movement. And so I actually see the roots of the New Democrats in them,
Explain that Atari phrase just a little bit.
So it's two. So the first, it's an iteration of like a group of people in search of a name. And so there's like a lot of this like testing out of what to call, both by reporters. And I probably like for you, it's hard to come up with names of people who don't like self-identify. So, so they're first called the Watergate babies because they come into office in the after Watergate, their opposition actually was less to Nixon and more to what was going on in the Democratic Party. So that they are really like, we don't like the kind of Great Society, Tip O'Neill approach. There needs to be a new kind of solution. And so it's this young group of primarily white, Ivy League educated, mostly with suburban bases. And so it's a lot of people like Tim Wirth and Gary Hart's another, who's a senator, both from Colorado. And they're one lens into what becomes the New Democrats, and then they be called the Atari Democrats for their faith and their support of tech, and this like embrace of technological solutions. And Tim Wirth famously said that he wished they were called the Apple Democrats because that's more American. So that Atari was like not the best term. But for those of you who don't know, Atari was a popular video game in the early 1980s. And they actually were okay with that phrase. Then when they moved to Japan, it was kind of when Atari moved its corporation or its factories, it was worse. But that becomes for their sort of faith in tech. And then that group who kind of they largely move through Congress, and so Al Frum was a staffer on the Hill, and are sort of trying to shift the party. Then merge with another group of Democrats who are largely sort of southern governors who are much more sort of moderate and centrist and want the party to move in that way. And so they come together after the Mondale election to sort of say we need to take action and we need to, or not election, campaign, failed election, landslide loss, that we need to take action. And that's what sort of leads to the formation of the DLC. And then they take on this term New Democrat as their kind of to indicate their new terminology.
You sort of blanch at neoliberalism mainly because you think that term has come to mean everything and therefore nothing.
Well, the other thing that's interesting is these are actually the first people to be called other than like Hayek, to be called neoliberal, and it's used in a different way. And so that's another term they sort of test out. And their way of doing it is kind of new liberal. The way I think about it is, I think neoliberals become stretched really thin in its usages. And so it's lost some of its meaning. And there's a way in which this is actually like a democratic version of neoliberalism, but it's not necessarily the same as what Reagan and someone like Milton Friedman were arguing for. And I think especially because of this sort of faith in, there is still a faith and place for government that's different than the kind of traditional version of neoliberalism. And I do think it is committed to helping people and helping poor people and helping low-income people. So that is a difference than the kind of traditional version of neoliberalism.
There's an interesting part of it that made me think of today too, in the sense that one of the as Biden moves to the right, I'm suggesting one of the things he's doing is they're finding issues where the Black community supports them on it. So it's like the number one response to the fund the police thing has been, you've seen the sort of Black activist community be opposed to that, but polls show Black people, and they've had a lot of Black leaders do that. I thought, and Obama was, of course, even though he was the sort of neoliberal but he was sort of, they found it was a Black person embraced Clintonism on some level. So I thought that was a new thing, but you suggest even in the 80s, I think, was it Mike Espy? It sounds like there was an early awareness that, this new Democrat thing can't be a white guy thing, and let's bring, and Jesse's opposing it, so we need to talk about that a little bit, how the race.
So Jesse Jackson calls them the Democrats the leisure class, and is like very opposed to the and has all these kinds of these names of like and they were called like the Southern White Boys Club, and this idea that it was just Southern whites, even though it wasn't all Southerners. They had they had Dick Gephardt be their first the first head, because to represent the kind of more Midwestern base, and they did have Biden and other figures who weren't necessarily part of but they were all white men, and so there isn't, because of that sort of targeting, that there is this kind of appeal to politicians of color. And so Mike Espy is critical. It becomes critical. Doug Wilder joins as well. And so this effort to kind of find particular representatives of color. And I think that is kind of increasingly becomes part of the thing. I think there's also the really fascinating question of, this goes to all groups, and this goes to the question, I think the other side actually to the issue of like the pushback from how did the Clinton era deal with the 1994 and the conservatives, is what that also did to other so-called interest groups and what they were doing. But I think it's also what Black politicians, the navigations that they have to make. So someone like John Lewis chooses to support and endorse Clinton after Sister Souljah, because it's kind of like, this is our option, and like this is our chance to regain the presidency. And so I think there's a lot of negotiations like that go on throughout the 1990s as well.
So you've done this book about this part. So where is the story now, so to speak? What are you looking for? We talked this a little bit. So what's this? So the book kind of ends in 2004 on some level, or 2001. Where do you sort of say the era of neoliberalism really, or the era of the New Democrats? Because at some point, I was a reporter, and I think we actually described how I'm pretty either the DLC sort of at some point really stopped operating, right?
Yeah, they end in I think it's 2009. I have to look back at that.
Yeah, and so what does that say? Does that say that that in 2009 the DLC had become irrelevant? Because there's two ways to think about this. One is its ideas had seeded so deeply it was unnecessary, and one is its ideas had been rejected. So where was 2009? Middle of that, or yeah?
Yeah, I see it as the former, that it's like that their ideas had been so embraced that they no longer were needed, or that they became embraced but in a different way. So I think that this question of like sort of having white Southern men represent the party, that goes away. But a lot of the ideas persist, and I think they've persisted. I mean, they've persisted today to some degree, deep into policy, in a variety of different capacities. I mean, I think there's still there are lots of ways that those ideas have become burdened and shaped policy in a variety of ways. So they sort of lost their particular hold and moment, but that they've embraced. And I think the fact that there's a lot of people who came up in this realm who now hold positions of power, or have returned into the administration, or holding other positions, proves that in some capacity, that the sort of legacy.
So what's your kind of, where does this take you in terms of what's your next? I mean, what do you want? Like, so two things actually. What was part of this book or part of this thinking that but didn't make it into either what was in your head when you started this that maybe didn't make it to the book or didn't end up being pursued? And then secondly, kind of what is your, not necessarily what's your next book, but what's your next project on the Democratic Party?
I don't. Well, the thing I was interested in doing more with, and sort of in my editor saying I can't write a 7,000 page book, but also as a historian, where the archives are located is a challenging issue, was the issue of foundations, and the power that foundations hold. And so I became really interested in this question around philanthropy, which I actually think, I mean, I'm a political historian or policy historian, and philanthropy is not often within the realm of where we think of when we think of politics. But I became really interested in the role that philanthropy comes to play, and the fact that, these presidents end their careers in foundations is really interesting, but also the increasing role of philanthropists, like these, and actually charter schools is a really critical example of that. That you see these kind of, you see the role that sort of big philanthropists like Bill Gates come to the power they come to wield. So that's really interested me, and I was able to do a little bit of it, but I would have liked to have done more, because I think it's a really, really important component.
Have you read Adnan's book?
I did, yeah. It was super.
That is closer to the book. It's not as historical, but it gets closer. But anyway.
Yeah, and so that was really helpful to kind of think about those ideas too, and so like adding some hits, so thinking about that. But I thought about that a lot, about that idea, and I think also the same thing about like, I think one thing that that book does, is also shows the ways in which these kinds of market-based solutions don't ask wealthy people to make sacrifices. So, and how that actually leads to inequality. So I think that's a huge part of when you use the corporations or the private sector, and you don't advocate certain kinds of redistributive solutions. You're increasing wealth, but you're not actually asking for any kind of personal sacrifice, and that's a huge part of it. So that was something.
Shorthand of this is sort of like when you ask Michael Bloomberg to fund your campaign, the wealth tax has to be gone, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly, absolutely. And so there's huge trade-offs to what that looks like, but also thinking about what the power that someone like Bloomberg wields, and increasingly wields. So that's something that is really interesting to me. And then I guess that leads into my next project, is to think about the Democrat. I'm interested in thinking about the Democratic Party and money. And this issue of like dark money, and the Democrats, because I think that's so often been told as a Republican story, and so I'm fascinated in the ways in which kind of campaign financing has changed. But that that's where I'm sort of thinking. But if you have ideas, if you or the audience has any ideas for books, I'm happy to take them.
In other words, you're hinting that before the kind of moderate Democratic ideology was driven by actual ideology, now you're hinting it's driven by the party has more. I've been thinking about doing a story called The Party of the Status Quo is Now the Democrats. In a certain way, it's like the party of the rich at some point. The Trump people have made the Republicans the party of kind of anti-multiculturalism, like a better way to say that. And that drives the sort of rich New York, Wall Street, Silicon Valley people away. They're now in the Democratic Party, but they want a party that doesn't fight inequality too hard, basically, right?
Yeah, and I mean, that's been this question then like throughout my work, and that was also in my first book about sort of the turn of the Democrats towards suburban voters, and so the shift of kind of moving away from urban union laborers towards more suburban knowledge workers, what that has done. So that's another thing of that affects the status quo, but I think especially this question of having more and more money and more resources and more people able to kind of shape policy has had a huge impact too. So I'm invested in thinking that, but I support your piece on this, on the status quo. Or
we're at the end here. You have any final thoughts before we close up?
No, I just want to thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and for engaging so closely with the book, and also to the audience for coming and for listening. And please, if you have any questions or anything, you can always email me and purchase a copy of the book from Politics and Prose. I was just, Chelsea was telling us that oftentimes people come to these events and don't buy their books on Amazon. So I want to encourage everyone to not do that and to buy it from Politics and Prose. So I'm really thankful for this opportunity, and to everyone for your support. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. What a fascinating conversation. But you're right. The audience patronage is what allows us to present such timely, interesting topics of conversation like this with two great people. So as a reminder, the book link is in the chat. It'll take you directly to the Politics and Prose website, where after you purchase the book, I hope you'll check out our events page. We've got lots of events coming up soon, several in person as well. We're sprinkling in some in-person events now. In the meantime, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Perry. Thank you, Lily, very much for a fascinating conversation. Stay well and stay well.